Hi everyone. In my last post, which I called the Dangerous Ape, I talked a lot about human history. And this post I'm calling the Civilized and Indigenous Dilemma. And as most of you know, certainly a lot of my initial explorations in terms of leading vision quests and various other things came because I had Native American teachers. In fact, kind of my first at least dozen, maybe even closer to 20 years, what brought me to the Vision Quest was the Native American tradition. And it's only since then, since the mid-1980s and on, I've come to engage in Vision Quest and also include the psychological tradition. So I'm really kind of interested in this this mix of the relationship between the civilized human and the indigenous human. And so in my last post, I was really expressing the hope that we, and by we I mean human beings, could become adults. And becoming adults involved embracing reality by looking in the mirror and seeing our gifts and our gold, while simultaneously owning and taking responsibility for our shadows, without avoiding or denying any of that. My hope is and was also that from starting there, we could focus on what's truly important, which to me is developing the practices and ways of thinking and committing to the stories and teachings that are most likely to bring out the gold, what's best in us, rather than submitting to that tempting dark shadow. And again, in that last post about, quote, the dangerous ape, I mentioned that the first humans, distinct from our ape-like ancestors, appeared about 2.5 million years ago. And from there, they spread across the planet in small hunting and gathering bands until the first appearance of civilization, 4,000 to 3,000 BC, or in other words, 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. Today, civilization is the outer condition, except in rare areas and instances, of virtually all humans on the planet. But there are great differences of opinion in terms of civilized or indigenous, of where lies the shadow and where lies the gold. And I just wanted to start addressing some of that here. When speaking about the civilized and the indigenous worlds, I assume that everyone watching or listening to this is part of the civilized world. If you're on a computer or a smartphone right now, you are in and part of the civilized world. And most of us in this world have assumptions, myths, and preconceptions about indigenous people. Some, generally labeled right of center, see the indigenous world as primitive and or underdeveloped, while those who are labeled as left of center see indigenous people as noble, uncorrupted, in some ways morally superior, and more in touch with nature and the environment. I think both of these points of view have huge blind spots. But left of center is mostly where I've been camped out for a long time. And of course, living in Vermont, I virtually never meet anyone outside of it. So most people that I'm familiar with think of indigenous people as, one, naturally and morally superior somehow. We think that being less corrupted by civilization is to be more connected to our innate goodness, and that's essential to living a good and fulfilling life. We also assume indigenous people are more connected to nature and the environment, and therefore having a wisdom that civilized people have lost and that the modern world needs if we're to avoid exterminating ourselves. We also tend to think of, generally, indigenous people as more peaceful, kind, and more able to live in harmony with the environment and all living beings. These three assumptions are all questionable. In the 17th and 18th century, these points of view were all part of the myth of the noble savage, and a reaction to the point of view popular then that the natural state was short, brutish, and a war of all against all. And this opinion justified a strong central government, usually a monarchy, with laws to control and prevent chaos. So, in my last post, I stated that we humans are descended from chimpanzees, and noted that chimpanzees, when encountering a male chimp from another band who wandered into their territory, would attack and tear him limb from limb. There's a story often told that when Columbus first arrived in the West Indies, he encountered the Arawak or Taino people. In his diary, he spoke about how kind, friendly, good-natured, and peaceful they were, followed by the comment, they'd make good slaves. This story, or data point, feeds into the noble savage, that indigenous people are good, civilized, or colonial people are bad narrative. But Columbus's diary probably says a lot about who Columbus was, but it really says nothing about indigenous people generally. Columbus happened to encounter the Arawaks because they'd been driven north by the Carib Indians, after whom the Caribbean is named. And the Carib Indians were a very warlike tribe who would prey on the Arawaks, who they'd kill and eat, as well as kidnapping their women to use as sex slaves and then eat their children, who were considered delicacies. This behavior, which is another version of indigenous people, doesn't live up to the image of noble savages. But it does sound like what our chimpanzee ancestors might do to an outsider. As to the belief that indigenous people were somehow natural environmentalists, in that previous post I mentioned that the introduction of Homo sapiens into North and South America resulted in one of the biggest and fastest ecological disasters to ever hit the animal kingdom. 80% of the families of large animals were wiped out in less than 2,000 years. This certainly wasn't on purpose. There are many strategies by which species survive. Some flee quickly, some are camouflaged and blend in. Rabbits are fast, shifty, and multiply rapidly. A single female rabbit can produce over 80 offspring a year, and they obviously survive by just producing huge numbers. But the large mammals, like the mammoths and mastodons and ground sloths and short-faced bears of the America, have a much longer gestation cycle and many fewer offspring. But their enormous size just makes them almost immune to predators. And many of them had few or no predators at all until humans arrived. And small bands of humans, with lifespans of perhaps 30 years, and perhaps just killing a few of these enormous creatures every year, would hardly notice a slow decline of their numbers. For them to have the long view would require some form of record keeping, which only came with the advent of civilization. So I'm going to pause here, call this part 1, and follow it with, well, for sure there'll be a part 2, and I expect, given my thinking on this subject, there will probably be a part 3 and maybe even a part 4. So happy to share this with you today, and hope that you can recognize and validate the parts of you that are indigenous and the parts of you that are civilized. And that you can look in the mirror, see both, and love them all. And love them all. Blessings. Oh.